Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So I want to just introduce a couple people just so everyone knows everybody else. Mark and Mickey, many of you know, are congregants who moved sadly to Ashland, but look at what they have in the background there. That's not a fake background, right? Not like mine. And Nathan Gonzalez, who is taking my Introduction to Judaism class. And then Jenny and Carl Preuss, who are friends of mine in Vancouver, also jealous of that. So welcome, everybody. We're going to begin with the blessing for studying Torah. And let me move it over. Here we go. I'm going to ask people to mute themselves and say the blessing behind closed mics. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. So excitingly enough, we are going to begin the book of Judges, and we are whipping through the Tanakh. The book of Judges is a sort of alternate facts about how the land of Canaan was conquered, because as we saw in the book of Joshua, there is this sense that the whole land was conquered, even though it's very clear that it wasn't. But especially in the beginning, you get the sense that the whole land was conquered. It was under God's guidance. And because Joshua was such a wonderful man, everything went well, pretty much, right? Now we get to the book of Judges, and we see that places that we thought were conquered are not conquered, people that we thought were dead are not dead. It's a very different book and probably much more realistic because it's very much, a very slow conquest, which is never complete. And it involves Canaanites who actually probably in reality joined up with the Israelites at some point, some of them anyway. So I want to share an article that I sent you this past week. I don't know if I got everybody in it, so we'll read it together. And if I didn't get it to you, why don't you let me know in the chat and I'll make sure that you get a copy of it. So this article, make it a little bit bigger so you can see it better. Okay, basically tells us that the book of Judges has a threefold division, a prologue, a main body, and an epilogue. But then if you break it all down, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the prologue, which I hope we'll be able to get through today, has two parts, not chronologically related. Again, there's no before or after theoretically, but you'll see as we read it, all of a sudden it looks like Joshua is still alive. And it sort of sets the stage for what we're going to see. The occupation of the promised land. And the second part talks about the period from Joshua to the rise of the monarchy, which basically takes us back a step because Joshua by this point is supposed to be dead. And what we find out, and this is really the structure of not only this whole book, but also the whole Deuteronomic history, beginning with the book of Joshua, which is that the Israelites rebel, they go off and they become enamored of other gods, they bow down to other gods, and then they get punished. And at some point, a judge comes along to help them out, to show them the right way. Things are fine, and then there's another apostasy and another punishment, and that's the cycle. And it's a cycle throughout the book of Samuel, the two books of Samuel, and the two books of Kings. Traditionally, it's understood that Samuel the prophet wrote this book, but it's quite unlikely. So each cycle has a similar beginning. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of God, and a recognizable conclusion. The land had peace or years of peace and led Israel for years in peace. And then we have these sort of more important judges in the sense that more time is devoted to them in the books. We have Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, and we'll find out a lot more about them as we read through it. And then they talk about how things are bracketed back and forth, which you can read on your own because it gets a little confusing reading it just out loud. You have to sort of draw pictures. And then the epilogues characterizes the era in another way, depicting religious and moral corruption on the part of individual cities and tribes. Like the introduction, it has two divisions that are neither chronologically related nor expressly dated to the careers of specific judges. The way the book is written, you sort of get the sense that each of the judges is leading Israel as a total nation, but really, as we saw at the end of Joshua, the book of Judges is actually we have a confederacy of the different tribes, each tribe led by a judge. And it's not a judge like a guy sitting in a courthouse. It's a judge who is a general and a leader and maybe a prophet and a lot of different things. And so what happens is that they get attacked by the Philistines and by Canaanites, and they fight back, sometimes with the help of another tribe, sometimes with the help of several tribes, but we really have a confederacy of tribes. They're not united, really, the way they will be later under a king. And that becomes the argument for why Israel needs a king. So before we plunge in, any question, comments? Okay, Nathan needs a copy of the article. Make a note of that.
Sorry about that.
Did anybody else not get the article? Jenny. Okay, Jenny will get the article. Okay, so we're going to plunge in. Now, I have it set up this way so that we don't have all those ads. If you want to make it bigger, if you go to the top of your screen, it says view options, and you can click on that and you can make the picture bigger. If I make it bigger, then we're going to get all kinds of ads, and sometimes they're ads that are quite inappropriate for Torah study. They're either very Christian or they talk about things that are really not appropriate to talk about. Do you see where it is, Susie? On top of the screen, there's a right hand, not all the way to the right, but there's a right hand thing that says view options. And if you click on that, you can make it bigger. Yes, Deborah and Devorah are the same person. Devorah is the Hebrew. And Mark and Mickey need the article. Okay. So does someone want to read?
I could give it a try.
Okay.
I'm actually still having a little trouble with a small script, but I'll give it a try.
Do you see where that view options is?
Yep.
You make it like 150 or 200.
Oh, really? Let's see. I have standard side-by-side, speaker side-by-side.
No, that's all the way over. It's on the top, kind of middle. Okay, well.
Viewing. Oh, I see view.
You see it. Yeah, Teresa doesn't have that option, but it depends, I guess, on the device.
Okay, I got it.
Were you able to make it bigger?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. I just don't want to have all that other
Sorry about that.
Stuff around there.
Let's see, let me go to 150. Okay, that's great. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand." Judah said to his brother Simeon, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They came upon Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table as I have done, so God has paid me back. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there.
Okay, let's stop there for a moment. So Judah, of course, is at the vanguard here. Remember who writes the history in the end, the last man standing, and that's Judah. So they're the ones who go off and conquer. And since Joshua has died, the Canaanites are apparently emboldened to attack them, right? Because, hey, Joshua's gone, maybe God's not on your side. Let's go attack these annoying Israelites. Cutting off the toes and thumbs. Apparently that was something that was done in that period to humiliate the enemy. And of course, it's a means to prevent further attack. But it's also a sign that we're going to have a very violent book. There's a lot of violence in this book. And of course, we had violence before because we talked about a lot of wars, a lot of battles, but these are very specific and very particular to some of the characters here. And they're almost worse because we get very detailed descriptions of what's going on. So this guy is brought to die in Jerusalem. However, we find out shortly thereafter that they were not able to conquer Jerusalem. So that's some kind of anachronism, right? Because they're not in charge of Jerusalem. How can they bring him back to Jerusalem to die there? Okay, let's keep going.
Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it.
See what I mean? Go ahead.
They put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the people of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arbai, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai.
Thank you. Those are not easy words. So here they are conquering Jerusalem, which supposedly they already had. And, Judah is doing pretty well against all of these other people. Okay, do you mind continuing?
Sure. From there, they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Sefer and takes it, I will give him my daughter Achsah as wife. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him his daughter Achsah as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. As she dismounted from her donkey, Caleb said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, give me a present, since you have set me in the land of the Negev. Give me also Gulat Mayim. So Caleb gave her the upper Gulat and lower Gulat.
So Gulat Mayim means water. So remember that we saw this in the book of Joshua, the same exact story? You may not remember it, but I remember it because of the paper I wrote about the women in the book of Judges. This is the first one. It's a very short story, but she's a pretty gutsy woman, right? Because apparently we found out in the book of Joshua that the land that they were getting was pretty dry. And so she's saying, you know what, I need some water to go with this. And, you know, she is the one who asked her father. She doesn't have her husband do it. She does it herself. And he does it. It's a little bit like the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. Remember them? This is in the book of Numbers when Moses is dividing up the land. And he says, you know, when someone dies, the land goes to his sons. And the daughters of Zelophehad said, wait a minute, our father had no sons. What about, you know, his land? And Moses doesn't know what the answer is. He has to go to God to ask. And God says, they are right. They should be getting the land if there's no son. So the law is changed because of these women, that if a man has no sons, the land goes to his daughters. It then later gets amended that they have to, excuse me, they have to marry within the tribe so that the land doesn't get dispersed. But, you know, they just boldly come up and say, this is what we need, and they get it. And that's exactly like this lady here. We don't hear much about her later. We don't, in fact, hear anything about her later. But, and this is also a, you know, a story that's pretty common about a conqueror of some kind who says, if you do such and such, I will give you my daughter. We'll see versions of that in this book. And then that's what happens with King David too. Saul says, whoever defeats the Philistines, who gets 100 foreskins of the Philistines, will marry my daughter. And David gets, you know, 10,000 foreskins or something. You know, he goes way above and beyond. And King Saul does not give him his daughter, but that's another story. Okay, do you want to go on, or does someone else want to pick it up? Dan, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, the descendants of Hobab the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arad. I'm actually curious, what is the city of palms?
Yes, I was going to tell you all this when you stopped reading. It is supposedly, wait, I wrote it down and I can't find it. Oh, it's Jericho, supposedly.
Oh, okay.
Oh, and something I didn't mention earlier was after the death of Joshua. That's how the book of Judges begins, after the death of Moses. So it's a parallel kind of structure. Just FYI. But yeah, the city of palms is supposedly Jericho. And remember Moses's father-in-law, Jethro. So he's a Kenite, and that's something to keep in mind when we get to chapter 3 and 4, because Kenites will be important at that point. Okay, according to the Targum Yonatan, which is a translation into Aramaic of the Bible, the reason this valley remains unconquered is because Israel sinned. Well, there are two explanations. One is from Targum Yonatan, which is that Israel sinned, and therefore they didn't conquer everything. Or another explanation is that God wanted some Canaanites to remain in this land to test the loyalty of the Israelites. Okay, I'm going to put these Canaanites here, and they're going to be worshiping all sorts of idols, and they're going to worship other gods. Let's see how loyal you can be to me. And also, they were supposed to conquer the Israelites were supposed to conquer the entire land of Canaan. They did not. And so there is a punishment, which is the sin is its own punishment. In other words, that they didn't conquer the rest of the land, so they're going to have these people, you know, bothering them for a long time. And 3 of the Philistine towns are supposedly conquered here, but it's actually not the case until King David. Okay. You want to go on?
Sure. Sorry for the interruption.
No, it's fine. I interrupt you all the time.
Yeah, so I guess palms in this region would be date palms, presumably.
Probably.
Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction. So the city was called Hormah. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory.
So those are the three Philistine cities. Gaza is, the area now that's Palestinian area, but it was where the Philistines settled along the coast there.
The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the three sons of Anak. But the Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, so the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjamites to this day.
See, again, we have the Jebusites who are actually in charge of Jerusalem, even though it keeps saying, oh, they took over Jerusalem. Well, they don't take over Jerusalem until King David. By the way, this whole battle thing, there's going to be more battles, but it'll get more interesting when we get to some of the characters in this book. So, of course, the chariots that the Canaanites have are more advanced technologically than what the Israelites have. So it's pretty hard to fight against them. Luz, the city of Luz, or formerly known as Luz, means hazelnut, which means a hard shell, and which implies that the city is impregnable. Okay.
Okay, so would you like me to continue?
If you wouldn't mind, you're doing such a great job.
I'd be happy to. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel. The name of the city formerly was Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." So he showed them the way into the city, and they put the city to the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. So the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named, just lost my place there. Let's see, I think, did you go down beyond where I am?
I think we need to go back.
I think we have to go back a little bit.
Back?
Yeah.
I didn't touch anything, but okay.
It just slipped.
Oh, it slipped?
Yeah. So they went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and named it Luz. That is the name of the city this day.
I think it's because you made it bigger, Dan, and maybe that's why.
No, it just suddenly slipped.
Really? Huh.
Okay, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. But the Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not, in fact, drive them out.
Oops, sorry. 29. Okay.
9. I am again off.
I think it's because you made it bigger, and so it's only part of the screen. We're on 29.
Okay,
it's on 33 on the screen.
What's that?
So everybody says it's
on 33.
Yeah,
it's on 33. That is so weird.
That's
not what I see, but okay, I'll move it this way.
Yeah, just again, it just kind of slipped suddenly.
Yeah.
And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, or the Canaanites that lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol, but the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or Alab or Achzib or Helba or Aphik or Rehob, But the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites continued to live in the Harhirs, in Ajalon, and the Shalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. The borders of the Amorites ran from the ascendant of Akrabim, from Selah and upward.
Okay, thank you for reading all those really difficult names.
Rabbi Singer, does
Yes,
that mean that they enslaved all these people?
it seems to be the case. Yes, once they are, if they're able to conquer, they can also enslave the people. But as you see, there's a lot of territory that has not been conquered. And again, the explanation, there's several possible explanations. Either they were not able to because they weren't strong enough. That would be something that we might say. Or if you were very religious, you'd say, again, God left those people there as punishment for their not having conquered the whole land the way they were supposed to in the first place, or they're there as temptation to make sure that these people are willing to be loyal no matter what the temptation, which seems pretty cruel and sadistic to me, but that's one of the traditional explanations. So any comments, questions before we go on? This part is not so scintillating because, well, I don't know, unless you're into war stories, which I'm not, but some of you may be. Okay, so let's go on to the next chapter. Oops, that's not the chapter. Here we are. Okay, next chapter.
I can read, Rabbi.
Thank you. I don't know, I really wasn't touching my stuff at all. I don't know why it was slipping around, but
You have to go to, I can't, it starts with the 2.
yeah, that's where it should be. It's chapter 2.
Oh, now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and fought and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my command. See what you've done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord.
So Bochim means crying. And they're crying because God's saying, hey, you didn't do what I told you to do. And therefore, now all of these other peoples are going to be your enemies. And I put them there specifically to punish you. Lovely.
Okay.
Now, here we are, death of Joshua. We thought he was already dead, right?
When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites all went down to their own inheritances to take possession of the land. The people worshiped the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. So they buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. Moreover, that whole region was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel.
So let me ask you a question. Do you have any thoughts about why suddenly we're back to Joshua? I mean, he died in the last book, and we started this book with after the death of Joshua. Why? And there's no right answer. Just like, let's just speculate a little bit about why do you think we're back to Joshua?
Like a prologue.
I'm sorry?
it's kind of like a prologue to the chapter again, where it's giving past information to fit things together.
Okay. Why would they need to do that, do you think?
They keep reminding, the whole thing is based on reminding you that, or reminding the reader that the Israelites sinned, they fell into some kind of moral turpitude and were going to be punished for it and had to be, cleansed of their sins again.
Yeah.
Seems like a reoccurring theme.
Yes, I think that's true. I think it's sort of, let's go back to a time when we had this, hero who was very loyal to God. And, we've just had this angel telling the Israelites, you haven't done what you were supposed to do. I'm going to punish you. And then we go back to Joshua, which I think is a reminder of a time when, there was somebody special leading the Israelites. Yes, Jane, but you're muted.
Didn't both Moses and Joshua tell the people of Israel, you're never going to be able to do this? Isn't this just a reaffirmation of that lack of confidence in
That's
them?
a good point. Joshua did say that, right? You're probably never going to be able to do, well, not so much you're not going to be able to conquer the land, but that you are not going to be loyal to God,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Remember
that's a good point, right?
Joshua.
So he kind of predicted this,
Mm-hmm.
and he was right. So I don't know if that's a good thing for him to be right about, but
it's different authors, and they're entwined
yes,
together to try to make a whole story.
absolutely. I'm sure it's another author, although whoever edited this chose to put this in here at this point, which is, it's strange. It's not the kind of logic we're used to, or the kind of timeline we're used to. But then again, I went to a really wonderful session at the CCAR convention this past week, which is the professional organization I belong to. Just looking at how, and we've talked about this, the Torah has no vowels. This is not the Torah, but the point is, the Torah has no vowels. Therefore, the Midrash feels perfectly free to take a word and to change the vowels. And his sort of, the title of his talk was Mitzvah or Matzah, because they're kind of spelled similarly. And he showed us a verse where it was about matzah, but it was interpreted by one of the midrashes as mitzvot, or mitzvah, because, we don't want to not follow a mitzvah and allow it to have leaven on it, the way we don't want to have leaven in our house for Passover and all of that. So there are ways, where you take a word and you move the vowels out of there and put new vowels in, and it means something totally different. So Hebrew is not a very precise language as a result of that. And in fact, Michael Lodker, my rabbi friend who's been here a few times, said that when he worked in Israel, he used to be a physicist, and he worked in wind farms. And he said that, and this is not the case with every company in Israel, but they wrote the contract in English, so it would be really precise, because Hebrew is not precise. And that's just the way the Hebrew mind is. There's, has no problem with things that seem illogical or out of order or multivalent, that this word could mean 3 different things and they're contradictory, and that's okay. So it's just a different way of apprehending information, very different from the Greek way that we've been trained in. Okay, so we'll go on with this. Okay, Sandy, you want to continue? I think we're at Israel's unfaithfulness.
Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and the Astartes. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune. And as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, they were in great distress.
Okay, let's
Then
just
the
take a
Lord-
moment. Sorry. So Baal is the Canaanite god of weather. Obviously, in the land of Canaan, weather is very important because if it doesn't rain, you will starve. And that Astartes is a version, I think, of the Ashtaroth, the fertility goddess. And you see that when the Israelites are unfaithful, it makes God really, really angry, right? Remember what blessing God asks? Teresa mentioned this yesterday in her talk. What's the blessing that God asks one of the rabbis to give God?
It's may your mercy overcome your anger.
Right, right. Because God gets angry a whole lot. And at least for the rabbis, this is of course the rabbi's imagination, that when God asks for a blessing, the blessing is, may my mercy overcome my anger. And, this is also what Abraham has to tell God when God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. In the Midrash, Abraham really tries to get God to understand you cannot run the world purely through justice, because justice is very, strict and kind of clear cut. Mercy has to be added in, and sometimes mercy should overcome your decisions, your decisions of justice. But yeah, God definitely gets angry a whole lot in our sacred book. Okay, any thoughts, comments, questions before we go on? So you can see now that God has allowed all of these people to stay and to punish the Israelites, which is the theme that we're going to have for the next few books. Okay.
Then the
Sandy, if you
Lord
don't
raised,
mind.
what?
I said, if you don't mind.
Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not even listen to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning, fetching, because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. In order to test Israel, whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did, the Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua.
Thank you, Sandy.
Okay.
And what is interesting is that they don't get punished because they are treating the poor badly or because they're cheating in their work, which I think would be a consequence of some of this. But the point is that is not what they're being punished for. They're being punished for going after other gods, which is not really based on ethics necessarily. I mean, the prophets will later say you're going after these other gods, therefore you're doing these bad things. But here it seems to be pure loyalty to God or not. Yes, Jenny.
Myself here. So it seems quite troubling that God would punish the Israelites through the actions of other people, because that raises essentially then these enemies or, become sort of the agents of God. And that is quite problematic because essentially then the enemies are doing God's work.
And that is the case. You'll see throughout the rest of the book, the book of prophets, Nevi'im, you'll see even in the prophets, they'll say these other empires are coming to conquer you, and that is a punishment. I am sending them.
Yeah.
That happens over and over and over again. Now, that doesn't mean that those enemies go unpunished themselves. They might be defeated by God's hand later. But yes, God is supposedly using all of these other people as God's instruments.
Yeah,
it is definitely disturbing. And the fact that God is so angry all the time, like we're supposed to be compassionate people. And yet what do? We have this God who's angry because you've gone off to some other God. And by the way, God kept these people there as a way to tempt you. It's like the story in the Garden of Eden, right? You can eat of any of these trees except for this one right here. And we all know that when we tell somebody something like that, that's the first thing they're going to go eat, right? So it seems a little mean or sadistic, right?
Well, it seems like it makes it difficult to know then how to react or feel towards someone who appears to be mistreating someone, because if they're meting out punishment, then, so it's really problematic.
I agree totally. Well, the whole way this is written, like, the cycle of, you did these bad things and you're being punished and then you're okay. And maybe there's some other way to teach the lesson, right? If you keep doing the same thing over and over again and you get the same result, that's madness, right? So, okay, the first, few judges, it didn't work. Let's try something else. But that's constantly the theme all through the book of the prophets. It's constantly. Harvey, did you?
Yeah, I was wondering, this is out of left field, but do some Orthodox Jews look at the Holocaust as God's punishment for something like this? Like, because this is such a reoccurring theme in the Tanakh that over and over and over again, the Jews did something wrong, God punished them, and then they got okay, and then they got punished again, and they, it goes back and forth all the time. So I'm wondering if in the Orthodox community, do they believe that the Holocaust occurred because the Jews were doing something wrong when away from God?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. Now, I wouldn't lump all the Orthodox together, but I believe it's a Satmar Rebbe who said that it's because Jews had assimilated into German culture that they got punished for that. So indeed, that theology has not disappeared.
Well, he's still angry, God.
Could be. Yeah. But, just the way the evangelicals said that the Katrina was a punishment for homosexuality in New Orleans.
Yeah. I see these kind of stories as basically our sages or whatever way of explaining why things happened the way they did.
Right.
And maybe justifying them.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a way to try to explain things. But I suppose there are other ways one could explain. But I think, remember, this material was written in exile.
Mm-hmm.
And it's after they were kicked out of the land and their temple was destroyed. So they had to sort of ask themselves, why did this happen? Right? I mean, and then that is what colors all the rest of the history, right? Which is then edited. Some of these stories, like in the Torah, come from way before exile, but they're all put together after exile. And, it's devastating. I mean, for the Israelites and the Jews subsequently, the destruction of the temple was devastating. I mean, this is where God's presence was supposed to dwell, right? And what does this mean? And they could have said, well, our God is not as strong as the other gods, and therefore our God got defeated. And that's why we were kicked out and our temple was destroyed. Or they could say, this was a punishment because we weren't good. And there are obviously other options, but those, seem to be the ones that they kind of had. And then they came up with this idea, it's because we sinned and therefore we're being punished. Suzanne?
I think for some people, it's sort of paradoxically hopeful because it means we can control it.
True, right. If we could only behave properly, everything will be okay, right? It's like, Suzanne is in my intro class. We're looking at the story of the binding of Isaac. And a number of people, said, it shows that if you believe in God, everything, will turn out okay. I don't think so. I don't think things even turned out okay in that story, because even though Isaac was not killed, he was certainly traumatized for life. But yeah, it gives you a sense of control. If I behave myself, everything will be okay. If I listen to what God says I'm supposed to do, everything will be okay. But we know that's not how life works, and that's why the rabbis included the book of Job and some other writings to say, hey, we'd like to believe that obeying God will mean everything's okay, but we know that that is not the way the world works, unfortunately.
I had another sort of possibly off the rails thought here.
Okay.
There really is a focus on straying away from one God to polytheism as being the absolute worst possible thing that people can do. And it might be the historical context here is that the Israelites were really not that cohesive a group. A small group of monotheists that were just surrounded by Canaanite polytheists that they were really actually fairly closely related to in terms of genetic relationship. And for the leadership, trying to hold it all together, the most important thing was keeping the thread of monotheism as a central focus, so that straying from that is even worse than cheating people in business, stealing, whatever, committing adultery. It's the very worst thing you can do.
So you're saying, and I would agree with you, that it's a way to keep the community sort of cohesive and willing to obey maybe a central authority. If you believe in one God, there's a central authority. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Again, morality and ethics do flow from this, because if you believe in one God, then there's one ethical code for everybody. If you believe in multiple gods, then people have different ethical codes depending on which God their allegiance is with. So, that definitely, it can lead to ethical problems. But it's interesting that the emphasis here is not at all on ethics. And actually, if you get to the prophet Hosea, his focus is much more on disloyalty as well. He's got all these images of adultery between God and Israel, whereas some of the other prophets are focused a lot more on ethics. We know the famous Isaiah passage, which we read at Yom Kippur, about, these fasts that you're holding are meaningless because then you go cheat your customers and you oppress people and you, don't take care of the widow and the orphan and the stranger and all of those things. So your, rituals don't mean anything because you're doing them and then you're going out and doing all the things that the rituals are supposed to keep you from doing. But he makes that connection, but it's not really made here. It will be made, but it's not made right here.
Suzanne,
yes.
I'm wondering, do you know roughly when the idea that sort of evil was the responsibility of people to correct it as opposed to looking to God? So that sort of the third way, that either punishment is because people did wrong, it's a punishment from God, versus, when bad things happen, that's sort of man's responsibility to correct it, as opposed to, God expects us to treat each other well. So it's less a punishment from God as much as a reflection of how people treat each other, and therefore it's the responsibility of people to correct evil in the world. And I'm just wondering sort of when that view began to become a possible answer. And
Well, I don't think that is not here. In other words, yes, you're supposed to be loyal to God, but you are responsible for your behavior, and you always have a choice. Remember, we don't believe in original sin. We believe that we have the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. So you have a tendency towards evil and a tendency towards good, and you always have a choice. But you're responsible, and if God punishes you, it's because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. I mean, I think it's all tied together in the Bible. Beyond that, I don't think it would be until the modern period that it's just, your responsibility, period. Because
Sort of reminds me of Rabbi Kushner's book,
yeah,
when bad things happen to good people.
yeah. And what is it? What part of it?
Well, he doesn't really blame God for his son's illness.
Right.
That instead God gives him the strength to cope with it.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it as, God punishes you, or you can look at it as God is there to help you through a tough time. And yeah, I mean, Kushner's book is basically that God's power is limited. Otherwise, there wouldn't be things like these kinds of illnesses, things that are not related to our own free will. But, it's very important to believe that we have free will. And which is why we talked about Passover in the intro class, and Passover is coming up soon in a week. The idea that during the first plagues, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then during the last plagues, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. What was that about? What about free will? And I mean, I think Eric Fromm has a wonderful way of understanding it, which is that at a certain point, there's a point of no return once you've hardened your heart enough, but that doesn't really let God off the hook, because it does say that God did it. And so if you understand it as God being your own, way of being in the world, and that at some point you can't change it, okay, but that's kind of not really what's going on literally.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Historically, to answer Jenny, historically, the Western worldview changes into personal responsibility with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution of the 18th century. There's a wonderful set of scenes in Voltaire's Candide, where in Portugal there's an earthquake, a major, horrible earthquake. And they decide to appease God by burning some Jews. So they burn some Jews, and there's another earthquake. So it was Voltaire's way of making fun of the church, and this message of punishment, that we should look to natural causes as opposed to this is coming from God.
But I think also your point about personal responsibility with the Enlightenment, I mean, in the Bible, it's really corporate responsibility. Like, it's not like, we did have that guy at the beginning of the book of Joshua who sinned, but the community got punished. And here it's always you as the people have sinned.
Right.
We're not pulling one or two people out. We're saying everyone sinned, which is probably not the case. But we know that if a society is majority a certain way, it infects the whole society, right? Like we're seeing in the United States, we have so many people who don't believe reality anymore. And, that affects how we can operate as a country. So, in the Bible, it's definitely corporate, it's not like an individual necessarily. And I think the Enlightenment is probably more when it's a sense of self and personal responsibility and being separate, from the rest of the people. Okay, great questions, everybody. All right, so let's go.
Can I?
Yes, please, Nathan.
I just, because you mentioned now this book concentrates too much on sorry. the chapters we were reading concentrated a lot on the worship of only one God. I think it was all. I think is it possible that this is also a response to the fact that because a lot of times when I read my historical books about Israelite religion and Egyptian religion and ancient Near Eastern religion, it says that early Israelites, you know, brought a lot of titles that belonged to Baal or to El or to other Canaanite gods into Yahweh worship as well.
Oh, sure.
And that's like, you know, I'm just wondering if this book is if this book is a response to that essentially.
Well, you know, there's nothing like original under the sun, as Ecclesiastes would say. So even the architecture of the temple was based on, you know, Canaanite temples. And, you know, some of the gods get incorporated into, for example, Yam, which is sea, you know, it becomes something else. So there's no way that, you know, the Israelite culture and religion is not influenced by other religions nearby. And for example, you know, the 10 Commandments and a lot of the laws are not that dissimilar to the Hammurabi Code from like 1800 BCE, but they're modified. So things are incorporated, but they're changed when they're incorporated, right? Even stories like the flood, Noah and the ark. There were other flood stories at this time because there were floods and people thought the whole world had been destroyed, right? But it's transformed. I mean, a lot of the stories and things are, you know, common, like even the idea of the sea splitting. There's an Egyptian story about a princess or something, or a prince who has this, you know, beautiful woman in his rowboat with him. And he gives her this, you know, beautiful hair thing, you know, to put her hair up, and it falls into the sea. And so the guy who's, you know, running the boat dives in and the sea splits open so he can find it. So, I mean, these are motifs and themes and things that exist in the surrounding culture, but they're transformed when they become part of the Israelite culture. So yes, it's all very syncretic. Definitely. Any other questions or comments? Okay, let's go to chapter 3. And would somebody?
I'll read.
Okay, thank you.
Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generations of Israelites might know war, to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines and all the Canaanites and the Sidonites and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you just for 1 second. And this is another explanation for why these different peoples were left in the land of Canaan. That to show the contrast between the miraculous victories of Joshua and the need for training as warriors that they needed to do because Joshua was no longer there and because God's active help is no longer available. So they need to realize, oh, wait a second, we need to train ourselves. It's now on us because God is not as active as God was when Joshua was around. But then we now see this cycle that's going to begin. So they marry foreign women, their sons marry foreign women, their daughters marry foreign men, and they worship their gods. And so what's going to happen to deal with this? You want to go on?
Yeah. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of King Cushan,
Yeah, skip
yeah,
over.
of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites served Cushan, whatever, 8 years. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites who delivered them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb youngest brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave King Cushan Rishathaim of Haram into his hands, and his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kisna, died.
Thank you. So this is a little bit like what happened in Egypt, right?
Mhm.
The Israelites are being, sort of, I mean, here they are, right? And they did what they weren't supposed to do. So God then sells them into the hands of this other king, just like they were sold into slavery in Egypt. And when they cry out, then God goes, okay, I'm going to come deliver you. And the way God delivers them, and Jenny, as you see here, it's very clear that God sends out a group of people to punish them. It's not even like subtle. They cry out, and then God sends them a judge. So Othniel is the first judge here, Caleb's younger brother. And so then everything's okay, because this judge directs them to worship God and to be, loyal to God. And so they're okay for 40 years. And then he dies. And then what do you think happens next?
The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord, in alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. He went and defeated Israel, and they took possessions of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years.
So by the way, city of palms being Jericho, it's a little strange that they took possession of Jericho at this point, since they supposedly just razed it to the ground, but okay. As I said, consistency is not part of this.
Shall I go on?
Yes, please.
But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When the Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him, and locked them.
So let me just stop you for 1 second. So this is pretty gross. As I said, it's a very violent book. And so now we get another very violent detail. Before that, we had the toes and fingers of the guy cut off. Now we get this fat guy who is so fat that when the sword is put into his belly, it sort of disappears in there because the fat closes over it. And of course, it also means that he has to relieve himself. And so he's closing the doors because he's embarrassed. And keep going.
After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their Lord lying dead on the floor.
So this is how Ehud was able to escape because, they thought he was going to the bathroom and they didn't want to disturb him. And during that time, you'll see that he escaped. By the way, you notice that he's left-handed, which is the reason he was able to pull this off because, he used a hand you wouldn't expect to be used. And part of what is going on here is at the beginning of this period of tribal confederacy where things aren't set, you have people who normally would not be in a position of power, which is going to include women, but also people like left-handed people. As we said before, if being left-handed up until fairly recently was considered to be, problematic. So this guy normally would never have been a judge, but he is during this period. Okay, let's see about his escape.
Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculptured stones and escaped to Syria. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him as their head. He said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went down after him and seized the ford of the Jordan against the Moabites and allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they killed about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years.
And one more verse, please.
After him came Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel.
Thank you. So we already see the pattern here, right, of sin, punishment, and delivery by a judge. And then the same cycle starts.
What an ox goad is?
I do not know what it, I don't know what it is. It's some special instrument. Suzanne's going to look it up.
Okay, good.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Because what I want to do is I want to share with you my paper, but I need to make it bigger so you can see. Let's see, zoom.
Did it disturb us how God uses people like, it's almost as if like he uses them like puppets, basically?
Yeah, it sure sounds like that, doesn't it?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And, obviously I don't mean to say that God is evil in a sense, but,
Well, we
I'm just
always have to
wondering.
remember that this is how human beings understood God. It doesn't mean this is how God is, right? This is how we understand God. This was written by people trying to understand what was going on in the world. And hopefully, I mean, that's not the God I believe in. In the intro class, we're going to look at a lot of different ideas of God in Judaism. So there isn't one way to understand God. But certainly this is people's attempt to understand, what's going on in their lives, because I'm sure they kept being conquered and they had to say to themselves, why is this happening? Must be because we were being punished. Okay, I'm going to share the beginning of my paper because we're going to talk about some women now. So the book of Judges covers the period of Israel's tribal confederacy prior to the monarchy. The country, though unified by a common need for self-defense, is not yet unified politically. Public institutions and structures have not yet been constituted, accounting for more egalitarian relationships between the sexes. In Discovering Eve, Carol Myers explains that the absence in early Israel of developed hierarchies in political and economic spheres created an atmosphere that would have allowed for non-hierarchical gender relationships. In other words, it wouldn't be necessarily that men were in charge and women were subservient. Cross-cultural analogy suggests that both males and females worked very hard and contributed nearly equally to the demands of establishing arable plots of land and eking out a living from them in the rocky, seasonably arid hillsides of the Palestinian highlands. So in other words, in those days, at the very beginning of the Israelites in the land of Canaan, it was very, very hard work. And work and home were pretty combined, a little bit like they are right now during this pandemic. It's not like, men went off to work and women were at home. I mean, the men were maybe working the land and the women were, making cloth and clothing, and, it was all sort of, in one general area. And if the men had to go off to war, the women would then take over some of the agriculture. So, it was more of an egalitarian split of work. Okay, Suzanne says, ox goad is like a cattle prod, combo of a staff with a spear on the end and a sharpened shepherd staff. Thank you. Sounds like it could be pretty lethal. So Myers concludes, when public society is not highly differentiated from the domestic realm, the role of women is significant. So in other words, the domestic realm is the work realm. And so it just changes the dynamics between the sexes. This is the socioeconomic situation as the book of Judges opens. And it's reflected in the status of women like Achsah, remember her? The bold daughter and wife, Devorah, the virtuous leader, and Yael, the courageous fighter. By the time Judges ends, however, the well-being of the budding nation is threatened by pressures from within the society because of an expanding population, and from without because of the increasing military threats from the Philistines, Pelishtim. Centralization is needed for survival, and indeed Judges is a prelude to Samuel and the establishment of the monarchy. This chaotic pre-monarchical time, so before the time of the king, is reflected in the concluding portrait of the book of Judges, that of the Levite's concubine, who was both gang raped and cut into 12 pieces. Get yourself ready for that. That's chapter 19. It's pretty gross. So Adrian Janice Bledstein observes that at this juncture, men's disregard for women is symptomatic of lawlessness and violence. You can be sure that if women are treated badly, there are other issues going on, right? The place of women among men reaches an all-time low. We have come full circle from the promise of the opening of Judges. So at the beginning of Judges, you have women in positions of power. By the time you're at the end of Judges, you have women in complete, low position and mistreated. And so that the society has a serious problem. So these two scholars point to this contrast. The ending of the book is filled with echoes of its beginning. Judah leading the fight, a story of dismemberment, a woman on a donkey, all images that have been skewed in the course of time. The woman on the donkey rides not erect and determined. Well, you'll see what happens with Levite's concubine, okay? But it's a similar image to a woman on a donkey. Okay, so let's start with Achsah. Again, as I mentioned, she's the one who says to her father, I need some water. Like, you gave me some very dry land. I need water now. And as I mentioned, her behavior echoes that of the Zelophehad's daughters, because they're the ones who say, wait a minute, what are we going to inherit? Our father died, there's no sons. So she's as bold as those women. Achsah's role as instigator, a woman who takes charge of her life, is underlined by the construction of her story, and in particular, by the way, okay, so unfortunately, all my Hebrew got messed up because the font I had at the time I wrote this no longer exists. So you get gobbledygook here. And at some point I need to probably go in there and fix it, but that's why you'll see all these strange combos of letters. But anyway, so her as someone taking charge of her life is underlined by the construction of the story and by the way the verb to give is used. In the first part of the story, Kalev, offers to give his daughter in marriage to the victor of Kiryat Sefer. He then gives Achsah to Othniel. So in other words, she's just the object, right? She's spoken of passively as an object of others' actions. But 3 verses later, Achsah takes control of the situation. She asks her father to give her a blessing and the pools of water, and he gives them to her. So through her own initiative, Achsah has moved from being acted upon to being the actor. Okay, it's very subtle. At first, she is given, right? She's given to the victor. So she's the object of the verb to give. But then she becomes the subject of the verb to give. So she's taking control of her life, and she becomes the actor here, as opposed to being acted upon. Then there's another verb in the second part of the story, underlining the forcefulness of her position as she puts forth her request. In verse 14, before speaking to her father, text tells us, and she descended from her donkey. And this is the same verb that's later going to be used to describe Yael's bold action. All right, we're not going to go into too much of it right now, but it is a powerful verb. And once she descends, Achsah's father immediately responds to her appearance, asking her what she wants, and he gives it to her. And Kaleb's respectful reception of his daughter is distinctly contrasted with Jephthah's greeting of his daughter, which we'll learn more about soon. So the turning point for Achsah, when she goes from being an object to being a subject, occurs at the moment right in the middle of the story when she comes to her husband and asks him to prevail upon her father. Lillian Klein suggests that Achsah gets her way by using her sexuality, and she claims that judges extols women who take the initiative within the constraints of patriarchal mores. In other words, sometimes women, just like in the story of Esther, have no other choice but to do something important, but within the constraints of the society they live in. So Esther can't save the Jews on her own. The only way she can save the Jews is by going into her husband with the risk of his deciding to kill her for coming in uninvited, and then appealing to him through setting up a feast, which is the kind of thing he likes. So that's to say, Achsah is also operating within the bounds of patriarchal culture, where she has to use her sexuality to get people to, be willing to give her what she wants. So Klein accomplishes this by interpreting when it says that in her coming, that's Achsah, as a word phrase which refers both to her coming to her bridegroom and to sexual intercourse. Klein suggests that Achsah chooses an optimal moment to speak to Othniel. A second implication of the phrase, as she came, suggests that Achsah waited until the marriage was consummated to express her wishes. In other words, she's going to wait until her husband is feeling sexually satisfied, and then she's going to ask for something, which is a bit of a twist on, in her coming, it meant she's coming on her donkey, but okay, they're stretching the definition of that. So she's astute and understands that after sexual intercourse, Othniel would be more receptive to his wife's request. Finally, it should be noticed that though Achsah is described as asking her husband to talk to Caleb, we never hear Othniel's voice, and it's ultimately Achsah who does the talking. The story opens with Othniel's great military feat, but he disappears from the scene by the end of the story, and his wife takes center stage. The shift in focus is the reverse of what happens to women later in Judges. Okay, so let me just stop for a moment and see if that was clear to people, if that made sense. It's, scholarly language, which can be a little, thick, but I think it's pretty clear. So the first woman that we meet takes agency, from being acted upon, she becomes the actor. And that's significant. And then Devorah and Yael will also be significant, strong women. And then we go downhill from there. Any questions before we go on to Devorah? If you were at the service last night, they sang the Devorah song. Yeah, it was fun. So you might want to take a look. All right, here we go to Devorah. All right, we're going to read about her before we read. So the next story is the judge Devorah. Now, Carol Myers explains the plausibility of a woman involved in military affairs. Because, gee, really? Was she really a general? What happens is she's got this guy Barak, who's her army commander, and the rabbis say, well, he was really the general. No, it's very clear that she is. Hello. So Carol Myers explains that localized and sporadic defense problems existed during this period, but they were met by a non-centralized ad hoc militia system. Without the formalized structure of a standing army, women could and did contribute to the defense effort. Female participation in the military realm is in fact a typical feature of pioneer societies. So in other words, again, they don't have an army. They have a bunch of tribes that are loosely connected by a confederacy, and they get together when they need to, some of them, not all of them together. So it isn't all, set and structured. Once it's set up and structured and all that, then the women start to disappear. So with regard to Devorah's position of leadership, Grace Aguilar points out, so naturally are her public position and personal gifts described, we cannot possibly believe in her elevation to be an extraordinary occurrence. Grace Aguilar is a very early feminist. But how does the narrator of Judges see Devorah's elevation? Given the fluidity of the social and political situation, all sorts of, quote, social misfits and outcasts were able to occupy influential positions. That's what I was saying earlier. In addition to a woman, a left-handed man, the son of a concubine, and a murderer, they all serve as judges as well. Women, of course, being in the category of social misfits. What can you do? Indeed, Yotam's parallel in Judges 9 suggests that there were no honorable people during this period willing or able to serve as political leaders. Gee, that might sound kind of familiar. Once it's lethal to be a political leader, only misfits are interested in being, in the leadership position. But is Devorah another misfit? Judges makes quite clear that there's a major difference between the various men who serve as judges and Devorah, the only female judge. Whereas most of the male judges exhibit one form of moral weakness or another, Devorah is unique in her virtue and courage. Cheryl Exum calls her one of the few unsullied leaders. The judges who follow her are particularly flawed. Gideon, for example, must consistently be convinced that God is really on his side. Devorah, on the other hand, never doubts God for a moment. Instead of needing reassurance, she is the one to reassure her own army commander, Barak, who was afraid to go into battle without her. So how the rabbis go from Barak being afraid to go into battle to he's really the general and Devorah is just, the girl who tagged along. I don't know how they get there, but anyway. Avimelech kills 70 of his kin in order to reign. And Yiftach, which is Jephthah, sacrifices his own daughter to gain military victory. Devorah, on the other hand, never commits a transgression to achieve or maintain her leadership. Furthermore, Devorah is portrayed as more than a charismatic military leader. She has the unique distinction among the judges of being not only a military commander, but a prophet and a poet as well. Mikebal sees in these designations a portrait of an outstanding ruler. Significantly enough, Deborah, see some people call her Devorah, some people call her Deborah, the ideal judge, leader, and animator of the people is not referred as a gibor. It is obvious that the concept of gibor, which is a warrior, is exclusively male. It requires no wisdom, but only violence, no insight, only bodily strength, no poetry, only cutting words. Indeed, the male judges are shown in their military roles only. By contrast, as her story begins, we find Devorah judging the children of Israel under a palm tree. Her fierce and beautiful poem is the fitting finale of her chapter. which concludes with the statement that her reign brought peace to the land for 40 years. So she is a very special person. Any thoughts or comments before we maybe read a few verses of the story of Devorah? No? Okay, let me share my screen and we'll go back to the text here. All righty.
I can
Somebody
read
feel
it.
like reading? Yes? I'm sorry, what?
This is Jane, and I said I could read if you want me to.
I would love you to read. Thank you.
Oh, okay. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Haroset HaGolim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go."
See? Brave and courageous.
And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Devorah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went with him.
Okay, we're going to stop there. So we've been introduced to Deborah, who clearly is the leader, not Barak, and not her husband, Lapidot. We only know she's married to him. We don't know anything else about him. And the next story will be a very interesting story about Deborah and Yael. And as I said, this is a violent book, and the women are violent too. So it'll be a very interesting story. It'll be much more interesting than all these, bits and pieces about how, they took this land, they sinned, this is good stuff about women. When we're done with reading the book of Judges, if you would like to get my paper, I will share it with you, but I'm not going to share it yet because I don't want you to peek ahead. Yes, I want some suspense here, so keep coming. Any last comments or questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you all and have a wonderful Shabbat, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi,
Rabbi, when is the
Shabbat
next
shalom.